The only time ska really went away is after it lost popularity in Jamaica.
Hmm.
So in the mid 60s, when they started playing rocksteady and then reggae and then roots reggae, from that period until ska was revived in the UK by the two-tone bands, I would call that the only period of time where ska was kind of not very popular.
Aaron, hey, welcome to the Question and the Answers podcast. How you doing?
Hey, thank you. I'm good. And thank you for having me on.
Yeah, of course. Aaron Carnes is the author of the book In Defense of Ska. Yes.
We both have them.
That's right. We just got it today, actually. I was able to read it on my e-reader. And man, as a person who totally enjoys ska music, it was such a rad dive down into like the history of ska as we know it.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I'm thoroughly impressed with the way that you were able to get in there and kind of dig into the history of some of these bands that, some of which are well known, some of which are a little bit more obscure. But, I really enjoyed the fact that you dove into like the deep history as its origins in Jamaica, like leading into, the two-tone movement in England and the UK, and then how it came over into the States and kind of branched up in like the 70s and 80s, and then obviously the third wave in the 90s and et cetera. But I mean, man, you cover so much. And, Aaron also is a musician who happens to have been in a ska band over, it was called Flat Planet, right?
Yeah.
Yeah. And you played drums.
Yep. I was a drummer.
That's right. And he's also been in a few other bands that we'll kind of dig into. But, Aaron, give me an idea of what your kind of inspiration for the book was and like why you chose to write it.
Well, I chose to write the book because ska was my favorite music back in the 90s. It was the kind of music I played. It was the kind of music I listened to. It was the shows I went to. I mean, I liked other music and I still like other music, but that was the music, the first kind of music I just truly fell in love with. And I became a music journalist in like 2010. I started writing for newspapers and stuff. And the more I was doing music journalism and getting into reading books on music and stuff like that, the more it was clear to me that ska was just completely ignored and totally not taken seriously. So I felt like I wanted to write about ska. I wanted to do something. For one reason was that it just felt like it wasn't really covered. But the other thing was because it was something I loved that I just, felt like I could contribute to. The issue I had was that I didn't really quite know what I wanted to say about ska. So I just was kind of collecting interviews for a number of years, probably like 5 years. I started this project in 2013, and probably for a good 4 or 5 years, I was off and on interviewing people. And I drafted some chapters, not really clear what I wanted to do with it. But what happened was I felt like in order to progress with this project, I needed to try to get a publisher on board because I was just working on my own. And as a freelance journalist, I'm constantly tugged by deadlines. That's what makes me work, is deadlines. I didn't have a deadline for my book, so it constantly was not my priority. So I was like, I need to get a publisher on board. That'll like force me to write this. So the act of getting a publisher on board meant I had to write a proposal, and the act of writing a proposal meant I had to be clear on what this project is and what I was trying to say. And through that, I realized that the thing that I was drawn to was the fact that the music wasn't taken seriously. So that's why I wrote a proposal that it was a defense of ska. So it would kind of also, it enabled me to kind of have fun and be a little bit lighthearted with it, but it also kind of freed me up from this sense that I needed to tell a complete story of something specific related to ska. So instead of doing that, because I was writing a defense, I could just sort of pick and choose things, because the theme was that I'm defending ska. Ska is not taken seriously. It should be taken seriously. So that's what everything was tied to. So I could jump around. I could talk about this era. I could talk about this time period, this scene, these bands. I could talk about my own band. I could whatever I wanted to do. And that happened in 2018. And from then I got a publishing deal with this place out of New York called Clash. And then from then on, it became my top priority, and I put it together over the course of a couple of years.
That's awesome, man. I mean, because finding a publisher is such a huge task in and of itself.
Yeah.
Because you have, like you said, you have to have this proposal, and then they have to at first be even interested in it, and then you have to have like the rough draft, and then you got to go through all the process of like basically convincing them that this is going to be a book that's worth their time and money and effort to like help you get out there into the world. And you're right, like ska is this music that it unfortunately has been, like you said, like always been like the redheaded stepchild of like the music world in a lot of ways. I mean, there's a lot of obscure genres out there that people are very intensely into, that don't get nearly as much of a attention as maybe it deserves. But yeah, like ska, I think especially in the 90s, like because I think we're about the same age. We came up in like the 90s scene with like that whole third wave thing. And yeah, like it definitely feels like there was this air of goofiness to it, and some of the bands that got so affiliated with it, like Real Big Fish, who you go into quite a lot of detail, kind of defending them as a band, which it's like a whole chapter dedicated to them, which I actually learned a lot about them during reading about that. And yeah, it's unfortunate because there's so many good ska bands. There's just so many that are quantifiably good bands writing very good music. And ska is this very rich, culturally rich music that came from Jamaica and made its way up to the UK and then found its way over to the States. And a lot of bands have put
world,
virtually all over the world. I mean, you have a whole chapter at the end dedicated to how it's made like such a huge impact in Mexico. Yeah. And like, tell me a little bit about that. Like, because I found that to be completely fascinating, because I certainly am not really, plugged into what's hip in Mexico right now. And to hear that ska is so big down there, I guess was not so much surprising, but it was just like, okay, like tell me more. And then when I read it and about like all the big festivals that are going on there, that was really cool.
Yeah, I first became aware of it because of what was happening in Latino communities in the U.S. In I want to say 2015 or 16 or somewhere around there, I went to see Voodoo Glow Skulls at the Gilman, and Eddie and we've at that point we had interviewed a few times, so we were friendly with each other. He invited me. We were hanging out after. Adam was there too, and he was just casually talking about. He's like, do you have any idea what's going on in East LA right now? I said, no, what's going on? And so he told me all about the scene that was happening down there in Latino communities that was completely separate from the rest of the city, the country. It was very insular, but extremely vibrant. Like thousands and thousands of kids would come to these festivals. And so I researched it more. I ended up pitching an article about it to Playboy. And they said yes. So I got to go to LA and I got to interview a lot of these people and really just kind of get a good handle on what this scene was. And people that I interviewed said I really demonstrated the scene well. So what I kind of understood too, that Mexico was important too, but I didn't fully understand it at the time. But when I was working on my book, I remember this Clemente Ruiz. He's the main promoter down there. The festival I went to, Ska, with Ska Wars and Ska Core Invasion, and I wanted to do a chapter about that. And I told him about it. I said, "Hey, I'm doing this book. I want to expand upon the article I wrote and demonstrate the scene." He said, "That's awesome, but you got to go to Mexico. You got to see what's going on in Mexico and talk about that too." And I said, "I would love to do that." So he helped connect me to some of these bands. He's the one that told me that there was this festival in Oaxaca that I ended up going to. Oaxaca, that festival wasn't one of the bigger ones, but it just happened to be the one that was playing in the timeline that I needed to go. But was interesting because it was very local in the sense that it was all the bands were from Mexico, a couple were from like Puerto Rico, Spain. They were all Spanish-speaking countries. The big festivals in Mexico now are really starting to draw like American bands, UK bands, just the big names of ska, Scotalites. It's amazing how many people go to these festivals in Mexico City, but it's not as insular in terms of Mexico's scene. But the one I went to was very much the scene there, and so it was amazing to see it and get to talk to these bands. Also, it was very interesting to see how the culture of ska there is so different. The music's not that different. It's very familiar. If you listen to ska, like third wave ska, or whatever, it's very familiar sounding music, but the music is known for being political. Like it's almost to the point where it's a stereotype that ska bands are political in Mexico. In fact, one of the band's managers kind of made a comment to me about how he's been trying to talk them out of breaking the stereotype of being political, because it's all the bands do it sort of thing, which is like totally opposite. Now, a lot of bands in the US that play ska are political, but that's just not the stereotype of them, of what people think of as ska in the US.
Okay, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Because it's kind of to your point earlier, there's the couple of big bands and then there's all these other bands. And in my book, I did defend Real Big Fish, and in that same chapter, I did talk about ska in the mainstream and sort of the progress of what songs and what bands kind of got popular. But that was pretty much the only chapter I devoted to mainstream ska. Pretty much the rest of my book is in different time periods. A lot of it's still in the 90s, but I talk about what was basically like this whole other scene happening at the time. And that was all these bands that were not on MTV, that were not on the radio. Maybe they had a little bit, but not really that much. But they were the ska scene, and that was the ska scene I was familiar with for the most part. I mean, I defended Real Big Fish in the book, but I wasn't actively going to see them very often back then. I was going to see Skank and Pickle. I was going to see ME330. I was going to see Blue Meanies. I was going to see Hepcat. I mean, those are the bands that I was really into at the time. And that was like, I don't know what you call that. It's like this, the shadow 90s ska scene, it's the same time period, but not the same scene.
Right. Oh, I mean, like when you think of Real Big Fish, at least when I think of Real Big Fish, I think of them as, one of like probably 4 or 5 bands that kind of got shoved into, the MTV kind of spotlight. And,
exactly. Yeah.
And we're all of a sudden what was representative of ska when, to your point, there were hundreds of bands, that were playing ska punk or ska type music of some other form, like ska metal, like hardcore ska, like or more traditional ska, and they were great. Like I mean, some of them arguably were not great, but there were a lot. There were excellent bands. I mean, you played in one. I played in a band called the Blast Bandits for a long time. And then there's tons of bands like Link 80. There was like the Sandwich Mafia out of like Stockton, California. The Les Distics out of Sacramento. I mean, tons of bands in LA that no one ever heard about. New York had, I mean, you spend a lot of time talking about the New York scene. And like that is just an incredible story in and of itself. Like how, the singer from the Toasters started Moon Ska, and like how that whole thing just turned into its own vibe and was pretty much the blueprint for ska in the US for that time period.
Yeah, it was the Moon Ska was very well. New York, and then the original version of Moon was very much rooted in more traditional and jazzy type of ska, which was unique to what was happening in the 80s and early 90s in the US. Like on the West Coast, well, I mean, the Untouchables were the main band in the LA, and they were more like two-tone meets like Northern Soul, and they were very much into mod outfits and stuff. But I was up in Northern California, a lot more punk type of stuff was happening. But like I was saying, the jazz and traditional stuff was happening in New York, and that evolved. And then when Moon started, it was representing that. But eventually, Moon became sort of the U.S. ska label. But their focus continued to be on stuff that was more recognizably ska. They didn't really go into punk ska much.
Right.
Very little punk ska. But then what you had was Asian Man Records really took that up. Originally Dill Records, which is Skank and Pickle's label.
Right.
And then when Mike left, he took some of the bands with him and he started Asian Man. And I feel like almost all of the really good punk ska bands came from Dill, Asian Man, or were on Mike's Misfits of Ska compilation.
Right.
Yeah. That's where I think you really saw that stuff. Yeah.
Well, definitely. I mean, my first exposure to ska music, okay, so it's not necessarily my first exposure because, I heard like Madness and like early Clash stuff on MTV, but I didn't really think about it as ska music at the time because I was a little kid, But then as I got into like high school, I remember the first two bands that I can recognize as like really introducing me to the ska scene was Mighty Mighty Boss Tones. A good friend of mine had turned me on to them because he had been living out on the East Coast at the time, and they were a band that had been touring for a while, but they still kind of hadn't really broke out in the West Coast, and so he introduced them to me, and I'm like, dude, this is awesome. And then a few years, about a year later, I got introduced to a local band that was playing like ska punk, and I didn't really know much more about it than that. And like after that, my world completely opened up. I mean, I learned about stuff like Operation Ivy, which I had no idea even existed until somebody finally like gave me the CD. And then there was this skateboard shop up where I grew up that they would sell punk bands, and I remember getting the Misfits of Ska CD from them. And that introduced me to like the Suicide Machines and, Real Big Fish. And I think Meal Tickets on there. I think Voodoo Glow Skull's on there. Like One Eye Open, like just all these kind of obscure bands that at the time weren't getting any attention anywhere. But Mike, to your point, was kind of being the champion for that, specifically like the ska punk stuff,
Yeah, I mean, those bands, all of those bands were pretty much obscure at the time, but like 6 or 7 of them ended up getting major label deals at some point.
Yep.
There were a lot of bands like Sublime. It's like an early, I don't even think I knew of Sublime at that time because that band didn't tour before they got signed. They were like a Southern California band. Right.
They were like a backyard barbecue band or something.
Exactly. Yeah. Where were you? What was your local scene? Where did you?
I grew up in the Sierra Nevadas, up near like Angels Camp.
Oh, okay.
And, there was a skate shop and in a town not that far from us called Sonora. And the guy who ran the shop, it was him and his wife. They had actually been living in the Bay Area and moved their family up there. So they brought their skateboard shop with them. And he had all these ties with the East Bay punk scene. And so he actually was doing shows up there. He ran a venue up there called the Borderline Warehouse. And, we saw a ton of bands up there. And him and his skate shop was actually probably the biggest catalyst for bringing, the punk scene up to that area. There were a few other people doing shows every once in a while, but I mean, the Borderline Warehouse was pretty much, where you would see shows during.
Do you remember the name of the Angels Camp ska band that you discovered?
Well, they were from Sonora, and they were called AAA. And I still have their 7-inch that I got at the show. But yeah, it was very like, kind of Rancid, Op Ivy-esque,
Well, I grew up in Gilroy, so I mean, my band was the ska band of Gilroy, pretty much. Period.
Right. I mean, because yeah, my first introduction to Flat Planet was actually the Misfits of Ska 2 record,
Yeah.
which I also bought at the Borderline Skates. Yeah.
Yeah. One of our few things that got out there.
Well, I mean, shoot, I mean, those were really big comps. Like comps back then were a big deal. And if you
Yeah.
could get on one, that was like major exposure because we didn't have like Facebook and MySpace and, you know, YouTube and all that kind of stuff. So getting on those comps was a really big deal. But,
Yes, comps played a particularly important role in ska. Like I don't know if I know that they played an important role in music in general, but for ska it was like extra important. Like because I think what they did too is they categorized them in a sense in a way that was organic because ska was so regional. So people would put together these regional comps and it would be an accurate representation of what was happening in a city that you weren't in and maybe didn't have access to except for the one or two bands that were actually making the effort to tour. So you could actually find out what was happening in Boston or whatever if you lived on the West Coast. And it was from comps.
right. Because you guys were also featured on that Bay Area Ska.
Bay Area Ska, yeah.
Yeah, that Tomato Head put out.
Yeah, that was Skank and Pickles drummer.
Right. Chuck.
After he left the band, he put that out.
Yeah, I mean that's a label that unfortunately kind of met its end a little too early, but that's for another conversation. But they had some great bands on that label. You know.
Yeah, that Blind Spot was on that. After I left Flat Planet, I had auditioned for that band as their drummer.
Okay.
And I didn't make it.
Oh. Wow.
I was denied.
Yeah, Blind Spot was a great band. Yeah, I caught them when they did their reunion a few years back up at the Phoenix Theater. But no, there's a ton of great ska bands that are totally like worth checking out. And, you know, thankfully we have, you know, places like Bandcamp or Spotify or even YouTube where some of that archive digitally is at least somewhat available. But there's a lot of bands where, you know, that stuff is nowhere to be found. And that's unfortunate because so many of them were really great and worth checking out. You know, one of the things that I wanted to kind of briefly touch on that I thought was hilarious that you talked about it in the book was that whole thing with Back to the Beach and Annette Funicello and Fishbone and that Jamaica ska thing, because I can definitely remember watching that movie as a kid and just completely being blown away by that whole scene. And anyone that doesn't know what I'm talking about, there's a movie that came out in the 1980s called Back to the Beach. It's got Annette Funicello, who was like a big Disney, she was like a Disney kid back in like the 50s and 60s. And, you know, she was like kind of affiliated with like the whole teeny bopper beach movie thing. And in the movie, there's a scene where she's singing this song called Jamaica Ska with Fishbone accompanying her. And it's just totally weird and out of nowhere. And that movie is kind of a great cult classic to watch anyway. You should probably check it out. But it's so funny, like reading about how people, like your perspective on that and how, like, man, like it was just such a horrible version of a great song with a really awesome band. I mean, Fishbone.
Well, let me say this.
Go ahead. Yeah.
The version in the movie is awesome. The version that she did in the 60s was not awesome.
Okay, yeah, sorry. I was getting that mixed up. That's right. You mentioned that her version that she did years ago, like before that, was the bad one. Okay, that's right.
Because originally the song was from Jamaica by Byron Lee.
Right.
And then she covered it. But Byron Lee, so here's the thing. I like Byron Lee and I like that version, but Byron Lee was one of the few people that we've archived in the Jamaican ska in the 50s and 60s that was not from the ghettos of Kingston. He was not actually part of that culture. He was kind of from the richer parts of Jamaica, and I don't know, there's a little debate about like his authenticity with that music. But that song was like, I don't know, it's an okay song. The original is an okay. It has that sort of feeling of being like this tourist ad, which it kind of was.
Right.
And then Annette Funicello covered the song. But what's interesting is that, when I saw Back to the Beach and I thought about it, I was like, wow, what is going on? Like, how did the ska song line? I'd heard I'd heard her song, her version original, but that's like the only ska song she ever did in her
Right.
entire career. So it just seemed so bizarre that out of everything to resurrect, why ska in like 1987 too?
Right.
But as I say in the book, the the brother of the film director was in charge of like authenticity of the culture and the music, and he was flipping through records, and he stumbled upon that, the original of Annette's original Jamaica ska. And he thought it was funny, weird. He just thought it would be interesting to bring that to light, and
Well,
so
it it is like this kind of surreal movie, you know, that almost borders on like satire and like just camp. It's very campy, you know.
yeah,
And I think bringing that element in there works on many different levels. But just yeah, like the fact that you've got Fishbone in there, who are arguably like one of the greatest fucking bands in the world as far as I'm concerned, you know,
yeah,
both live and musically. And then you've got Annette Funicello, who's like this '60s icon, you know, singing this obscure ska music that kind of came out of nowhere in the movie. And then, but that was the scene that always stuck with me. Like
mm-hmm.
I always remembered that. Like from the first time I saw it, I was like, that was very like I remember it for like verbatim watching it as a kid. You know?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, because 1987, like what was the state of ska at that point? Like wasn't much.
Like you probably had like a couple of bands out in like the New York area. Like, I mean, you go over some of the bands that were kind of carrying the torch during those kind of down times. Like you had Bim Scala Bim out on the East Coast, kind of bringing things up. You had the Toasters out in New York. Over on the West Coast, you had Operation Ivy in the East Bay. You had the Uptones before them. And that was actually really interesting too. Like talking about how that band really kind of was not the like the original ska band in the East Bay, but they were the one that kind of like helped to really make it more notable. And then like by proxy, that kind of helped to inspire bands like Operation Ivy and Rancid.
Yeah. Well, it directly inspired Operation Ivy and stuff because Tim, Jesse, probably Matt, I'm not sure, though they went to see Uptones as kids and were into it.
Right.
And Tim formed, what was his band called? Bad Radio, I think.
I think it's either Dead Radio or Bad Radio, something like that. Yeah.
Whatever. Basic Radio. Is that it? Basic Radio, I think.
Oh, Basic Radio. Yes. That sounds correct. Yeah.
Tim started this band before Op Ivy. But so after Uptones started, when Uptones were still a band, Tim was a big fan of the Uptones and he wanted to do a ska band too. I'm sure a large reason was because getting to see Uptones. See, that's the thing with ska is like you would get into ska, maybe you'd get into it from the Specials or the Selector, you'd hear these records, you'd go see Dance Craze. Those bands broke up after 1-2 tours, maybe in the US. And very few people got to see those bands play in their heyday. So you would watch Dance Craze, or you would see the local ska band, whatever the local ska band was. And then you would get to see what ska music was like live. And so whatever the local ska band was, that was a big influence on you. So Uptones were a big influence on Tim Armstrong for sure.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, that's great. I'm actually, I'm interested in hearing more of their music. I think I've heard like 1 or 2 of their songs. So like I'm certainly intrigued to dive into that rabbit hole with them and like kind of dig in like, okay, well, how did we get from them to like say Rancid, you know? Because I'm fascinated by that kind of stuff. But
it's definitely in the vein of like two-tone type of stuff because they were obsessed with two-tone.
Right.
Like, they were just worshipped at the altar of two-tone.
Right. Well, and the bands like that kind of predated them were like, you know, the English Beat and the Specials and like all those bands from like the UK. That really kind of took that on and like blended it with like the R&B that they were hearing. And I mean, I'm someone who has been enjoying ska music since, you know, I first got into it, you know, my introduction with like the Boss Tones and like those local bands. And then having been in a band that played ska and, you know, I've played a couple hundred shows in a ska band, you know, and it's just fun music. It's just really fun and energetic and lighthearted. And yeah, some of it's a little goofy, but at its core, it's got this really powerful rhythmic, overtone to it that can be, I think, a source of like positivity out in the world. And, one of the things that I really am also attracted to about the ska scene in general is that, you mentioned it earlier that like in Mexico, a lot of the bands there are like overtly political, and that's kind of the stereotype. While it's here in the States, the stereotype has been more about like, oh, goofy, blah, blah, blah. But in reality, there is this marriage of, unity and social justice and racial equality. And, that kind of stems from, what seemed to be like mostly coming from like that two-tone, era. And
What happened with two-tone, well, the difference between two-tone and even the stuff that came directly after it, like Uptones and the bands in America, Untouchables, Op Ivy, these bands, the two-tone bands in England, you had a much more direct connection to the Jamaican music and the punk music. So the bands that were started, all those two-tone bands, they were listening to old Jamaican ska. They were listening to punk rock. They were listening to reggae. They were putting these things together to create their music. It was fusion music, two-tone ska was. And we only say two-tone ska now because we're looking back to history. They did not call it two-tone ska. Right? This is just like a way we make history. But at the time,
there was a label called two-tone, right?
Two-tone was the label that Jerry Dammers, the keyboardist of Special, started.
Right.
And most of the bands had something on two-tone, but some of them, like Madness, had like one single. So they weren't like on two-tone for very long. But they were a scene, even at the time. They were a scene. They played together. People associated them together. But they each did their own thing because they were taking these raw materials and sort of creating their own thing about it. And then some of that was the suits. They took that from the fashion. Some of it was the politics. The politics didn't come from ska because Jamaican ska wasn't super political, but they were into the politics of punk rock and reggae, which was really popular at the time, like roots reggae.
Right.
So when that stuff came to the US, a lot of these kids were totally unfamiliar with ska in any form whatsoever. So they saw it not as fusion music, but they saw it as a complete package. The Specials represented what ska was. You were a ska band, you were political, you had bands that were different ethnicities in it, you had, you sang about like what was happening politically and stuff. This was the style. And so they emulated it as though those were the rules of the style. And so that carried on for most of the 80s, with the exception of bands that were doing it differently, like Operation Ivy.
Right. And then you get like
Fishbone, yeah.
You get like a Fishbone or a Skank and Pickle, who are blending, kind of, like Mr. Bungle-esque kind of like metal, like kind of circus act kind of sounding, like calliope sounding music. And then, then in like the early 90s, you started seeing bands like No Doubt, and kind of blending more like a funk element to it to a degree, like danceable, like kind of stuff like that. But
I would say Fishbone and Operation Ivy were the two bands in the US that really started to change the format.
Right.
From two-tone away from that. Those were the two bands that were breaking the rules as were established by two-tone, which was never supposed to be rules to begin with. I mean, that's why even if you go back and listen to two-tone, you listen to their first, second, third album, those bands are changing significantly with each album. And some of them are even moving away from ska, but it was because that was always the plan. The plan was always to be fusion music, not to be ska.
Sure.
Yeah.
And then you had bands like the Boss Tones, who were kind of blending elements of like rock and hardcore into their sound, but keeping that ska, kind of backbeat, like as like the foundation,
Yeah, they were more ska in the beginning.
Right.
They became more punk and metal and hardcore further into in the late 80s and early 90s.
Right.
They were more of a two-tone band initially.
Yeah. and then you had like bands that you've kind of mentioned earlier as well, like the Blue Meanies, who, I mean, Jesus Christ, dude, if anyone listening to this has not listened to the Blue Meanies, do it. Like, that's a crazy good, incredibly unique band, and just taking ska out of the picture, they're just incredible. Like,
Mhm.
this crazy unique sound. And there's some very interesting stories about that band that, you know, we won't dig into, but I've managed to catch them live. I played a show with them once, and it was like totally
Oh yeah,
awesome. Yeah, we the Blast Bandits played a show with them in Oakland with MU330. It was dope. But
nice.
yeah, and then MU330, actually, who, you know, Kindred Spirits, like, they were one of my favorites, you know,
Mhm.
and I know that you mentioned in the book that they were one of your favorites from that era
Yeah.
too. I mean, talk about just such a good band, just super tight, very unique sounding, you know, with respect to, like, you kind of point out that they kind of blended a little bit more like that Weezer kind
Mhm.
of songwriting style with, you know, the fuzzed out guitar, um, kind of Cars-esque kind of vibe with like some of their sounds, and like brutal live, like just so tight, so crisp, super fun to watch. And I mean, those guys were all like music, like majors, I think, in college, and like they all
Yeah.
met in college, like playing like music together, and like they just kind of just like, we're just gonna do this band now. And I mean, they toured relentlessly.
Yeah. They basically lived on the road.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, yeah. They were one of the bands that the Blast Bandits definitely like took a lot of, you know, inspiration from. And like we managed to see them and play a few shows with them, and they were just always super cool, super chill. And you know, it's unfortunate that some of these really, really good bands just, unfortunately, they kind of got overshadowed by some of the other bands that, I mean, you know, everyone's a critic, and everyone's got their right to their opinion. I'm not a huge Real Big Fish fan. I'm not really a huge Goldfinger fan, and I'm not really a big No Doubt fan. But they were the bands that kind of became the iconic ska bands from that era. And they're perfectly good bands. Like, they write good songs. Like, they're catchy, you know, and like, give
Mhm.
them credit where credit's due. But man, like, I would have loved to have seen MU330 get more attention. I would have loved to have seen the Blue Meanies get more attention. Um, you know, I would have loved to have seen bands like the Slackers or like Hepcat, or, I mean, the Agrolites are like one of my favorites, you know,
Mhm.
and they're still around, thankfully, and they're doing their thing. But, you know, one thing I wanted to kind of touch on real quickly is we have this new kind of generation, so to speak. And I know that you, in your book, like, kind of diminish the idea of a fourth wave.
Mhm.
But, you know, we are kind of seeing an uptick, it seems, in attention, at least, to ska bands and ska music right now. And there's a lot of really great bands out there that are really kind of pushing it forward. Like, we have Kill Lincoln, we have Omnigon, we have, I mean, basically the whole Bad Time Records, you know,
Yeah.
roster.
Well, I diminish the idea of the fourth wave, not because I disagree with your point that there's new bands and new energy. It's just more the idea of there being waves, I think, is the thing that's just sort of, I think, misrepresents what's been happening. And I think that plays into the idea that what was happening in the mainstream and on radio was what was important. And that's not really what was important back then.
Well, I think it goes on the same like idea too, that ska didn't go away.
Yeah.
Like, it was always there. It just, you know, wasn't the trendy thing at the time, you know? And, you know, like, I mean, ska originated basically in the 1950s, right?
Yeah.
So it's been a form of music since then, and it's only gotten bigger, really, you know,
Yeah.
because it's expanded around the world. And like, you have these giant, like, crazy scenes happening in, like, say, Mexico, or like, I know in Japan it's pretty big, and like, I think in parts of Asia it's like pretty big.
The only time ska really went away is after it lost popularity in Jamaica.
Hmm.
So in the mid 60s, when they started playing rocksteady and then reggae and then roots reggae, from that period until ska was revived in the UK by the two-tone bands, I would call that the only period of time where ska was kind of not very popular, didn't have much of an audience, was considered oldie music.
Well,
ever
because
since
it was pretty
two-tone.
centralized to Jamaica for
Yeah.
quite a long time.
Well, and England too, which is why it was revived there, because there was so many Jamaican neighborhoods, immigrant communities.
Right.
So that was a huge reason of how those bands were able to not only be influenced by this music, but kind of create a subculture from it. It's because it came from something that they and a lot of people at the time were familiar with.
Right.
And in the US, we weren't familiar with, most people were not familiar with that subculture at all.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. With some of these newer bands, the one that I think just personally, and it's not to like, discredit any other bands, but like, I really love Catbite. Like that band, I think just really brings this super unique, but fresh kind of, revitalization to like more of that two-tone kind of soul driven sound. And they're just doing it so right. Like I'm a huge fan of what they're doing. Kill Lincoln and Omnigon, Ska Tune Network, and there's a whole slew of bands that are out there that are also great. And I'm stoked to see it kind of revived. But like that's the band that I think I don't know, like if I could predict anything, I think that they're going to really like take off and do something kind of big.
They're a really good band. But have you heard Bad Operation?
Oh, actually, now that you mentioned them, like they're fantastic, and talk about like surprise out of nowhere. Like they dropped that first couple singles, and it's like, geez, like another great like kind of soul driven ska band that kind of in line with like bands like Hepcat and like the Agrolites, and that seems more up my alley now than more of like the ska punk stuff. I mean, I still enjoy that ska punk music, but I'm a little bit more just personally, I guess, attracted to that soul kind of, more two-tone ska nowadays. But I mean, I'm certainly open to all of it. But who are some bands that maybe people haven't heard about that you might recommend?
Well, you definitely mentioned a lot of the new bands I would have recommended. I do think that a lot of what's happening at that time is really, really great stuff. Jeremy from Ska Tune Network has a project called, I'm not sure if it's pronounced Jer, but
I think it's Jer. Yeah.
Jer, yeah. Couple of the songs that they've released have been amazing, and they have a full length coming out next year. So I'm definitely really looking forward to that. But yeah, this Bad Operation album is coming out next month. I've liked the 3 songs that they've already released. I think that's like supreme. I think they're really, really good. Bad Operation.
Yeah, I actually pre-ordered that album based off of the first single as well.
Oh, did you? Yeah, it's sold out. Like
the first run sold out. Yeah, pretty quickly. Yeah.
They just became a band, I think, this year. On top of that,
which is like, it's so funny because earlier this year, I put on my social network. I'm like, all right, like everyone's on a shutdown. I'm going to start a ska band now. Unfortunately, I haven't actually gotten around to doing it, but I was serious. And like, I would like to start a ska project because I do like the music and I think it's fun. But it is kind of hard to like find people to really do that with in a way that I think is actually fruitful, but my hat's off to them for doing it because they did it right. Yeah.
It's kind of odd that during the pandemic, it seems like a lot of these bands have been producing a lot of material and growing fan bases. Just seems like strange that in a time when we can't have shows, we can't have gatherings, that ska bands, who are typically the largest groups and thrive in live settings, have been growing audiences, like creating good music. It's really bizarre.
Well, I guess that's something that I did want to ask you about too. The ska scene, I think, because it's always kind of been a little bit on the outside, has had to really rely on itself to really be its thing to push itself forward. And like, punk music and like metal and some of these other genres that I guess were a little bit more globally accepted as it were. They, I think, don't have the same problem as like, say, a more like niche, like genre like ska does, where maybe they have to fight a little bit harder to get the recognition or to grow. But I mean, man, like these bands are just doing such a great job at elevating each other. And like, I'm truly always stoked to see how much they do for each other. And it really makes me wish that more bands would just do that at all.
Mm-hmm.
Like I see Adam in Omnigon reposting stuff from Catbite and Kill Lincoln and Jer and Bad Operation. And I see the other bands doing the same thing. And to me, that's like the signature of a scene, like an actual thriving scene that are there to support each other. And I don't see that in a lot of other scenes. And I mean, do you think that there's a reason why that is, like more so in the ska scene, or am I just not really seeing it in the right places? Like, I mean, I don't know.
Is it the reason why the bands are so connected and sharing and working together?
Yeah, I guess. I mean, I don't know if there's even an answer to this. I guess it's just something that I think about, and I'd just love to get your perspective on. Do you think that there's a specific reason why a lot of these bands are I guess a little bit better at it, you know?
Well, I think that ska bands feel a sense of an outsiderness that definitely brings them to each other more. And so I'm sure that definitely plays a factor in why they are helping each other so much and supporting each other so much. But I also think what's happening and why you see some of the energy for these new bands is because we're starting to see some of these bands that are young enough and savvy enough to really understand how the internet works, which I think hasn't really been much of a thing with ska for a while. And I think Jeremy's a huge factor because they are really good at Twitter and building an audience on YouTube. And that's really been drawing a lot of young people to ska who maybe wouldn't have otherwise even discovered it or taken an interest in it or even felt like it was relevant to them. So I think, and the other bands are doing it too, but I think Jeremy's leading the charge on that for sure.
Yeah, Jeremy's definitely done a really fantastic job at getting the word out and to your point, building that audience, and just done so much of it on their own,
mm-hmm.
like, prior to any help from any other bands.
Mm-hmm.
So I mean, totally, it's fascinating to see. There is one, I guess. I don't want to sound too critical when I say this though, and I'd love to hear your thought on this too. Something that I think I kind of wish I would see less of though is the covers. Just across the board in ska.
Mm-hmm.
Like I'm not just pointing to one or two bands. I'm talking about like almost all the bands seem to just thrive off of doing covers, you know, like in ska form. And as much as that can be fun, I kind of feel like it gets old real quick. And I don't know how you feel about it, but and again, I mean, I'm not trying to like, you know, be too critical or harsh or anything.
Sure, yeah.
It is fun, you know, but
it is a tradition of ska that dates back to Jamaica, really. I mean,
okay.
The bands that were playing ska in the very beginning, I mean, a lot of them were covering songs because they really liked American R&B and jazz and stuff. So they would flip the beat around and play these songs as ska. They would like put their Jamaican imprint on them. And then the two-tone bands, I mean, the Specials' first album is like half of that is covers.
Well, sure. I mean, even Sublime's 40 Ounces to Freedom has like, I think like 7 or 8 cover songs on it.
Yeah. So, I mean, it is a long, steadfast tradition in ska that across the board, doesn't matter what era. In the 90s, we had several covers were the singles. I mean, it's
right.
So I don't know.
Well, yeah, and again, I'm not trying to put anyone down for doing covers.
Sure.
That's fine, and they're fun and they're good. You know, like, especially when they come out good. Yeah, they're enjoyable to listen to. But I don't know. I guess I would be much more interested in hearing the original music.
Sure. Yeah. I mean,
you know.
Yeah. It's all good either way. But yeah.
Yeah. But yeah, you know, I wanted to kind of segue into your work in ska. So you were in this band called Flat Planet.
Yes.
And, you know, so I got introduced to you guys via those comps, and I never saw you guys live, which I was always a little bummed about because I had heard stories about how you guys were like kind of chaotic and, you know, did all this kind of craziness on live. And I was reading about it in the book, and it sounds like it was awesome. I mean, I've seen Skank and Pickle once, and I've seen a few of these other bands that were a little bit more like kind of hyper ska, you know, kind of thing. But, you know, give me a little info about Flat Planet and like your musical journey, you know?
Well, if you saw Skank and Pickle, you saw the band that we tried to be, for sure. That was definitely, they were our idols and the band that we emulated the best we could. And also the Misfits of Ska 2, that song on there, that is one of the few songs that I sing lead on.
Okay.
So just a little fun fact there.
Do you do the little voices too, like the hey buddy? Hey
yeah,
buddy.
that's me.
Yeah, it's a fun little song, man.
Yeah. Flat Planet. So we started. Well, we weren't a ska band when we started. Flat Planet was of me and my friends learning to play music.
Okay.
Initially, it was me, Mike Vinelli, the guitarist, and then initially it was my friend Bruce who played bass. The three of us were playing music. Bruce eventually left to do other stuff, and other people kind of came to the band. Alex, the singer and saxophone player of Flat Planet, he was one of the earlier members too. But eventually, when I was a senior in high school, so that would have been like 92, that's when Flat Planet, the first version of Flat Planet, like, came together as a band. We were a 5-piece band, and we were playing like, I don't know, somewhere between The Police, Rush, Pink Floyd. That was kind of our influences. Our singer, Alex, was in the band as saxophone player, but he wasn't the lead singer. We had this guy named Eric, and he sounded exactly like Geddy Lee. And he wrote extremely serious, very dramatic songs about being lost at sea or being trapped in a prison cell and stuff like that. So Skank and Pickle was a band that around that same time, I saw them like the first show. It was my first ska show, my first real exposure to ska in a way where I was aware that this was ska music and where I fell in love with it. After that, I really wanted to push Flat Planet into a ska territory, but it took a little while to sort of convince the band members, and I think some of it too was our original singer. He kind of needed to leave, which he understood, and he left, and he kind of handed the baton over to Alex to sing. And then when Alex was the lead singer, we were a ska band. It just fit a lot better, and we were writing new songs, and the songs were no longer were serious songs. They were like kind of funny songs and stuff. So some funny side story is Adam was friends with us.
Adam Davis.
Yes, Adam Davis was friends with us because he's from Gilroy too. He's a couple years younger than us. Mm-hmm. And he told me recently, I didn't know this story, but he told me recently that Eric, our original singer, told him or offered the lead singer gig to him, and Adam turned it down because he didn't think he was right, because he thought we were going to continue on doing the sort of Rush Police style music. But I never knew about this, and I don't know. I'm not sure. You know, I always thought Alex was was destined to be singer. So I don't know if Adam would have been our singer if that had happened or not. But that's a fun little story that I wasn't even aware of until recently.
Yeah, I'm trying to picture Adam Davis singing like prog rock.
Well, we were playing ska when Alex took over, but still, Adam was kind of he was all about screaming. So
right,
he might have.
He still is.
He did join the band eventually, though.
Right, he was with you guys for like a year or something like that.
Something like that, yeah. So Flat Planet, after we became a ska band, that's sort of the Flat Planet that was more active and was touring and was playing shows and recording stuff. There was a couple of years where we were out. We toured 3 times. We wanted to make a go of it, but we started losing members, and that's just killed the momentum. The first member that in that version that we lost was our guitarist Mike, because he moved to Oregon, and that's Adam replaced him. And then our bass player left, and then our saxophone player took over on bass. So that just really just stalled us. I was ready to book us for like longer tours. We did 3 tours where each tour was like 3 weeks long, traversing different parts of the U.S. I was ready to go. Like, I knew these ska bands like ME330. I knew what they were doing. I knew what you had to do, and you had to tour. nonstop. So because I booked the tours, I was gearing up to do that. I felt like I had, after those first 3 tours, I kind of understood how to book better, get better shows. So I was ready to do that, but it just didn't happen. But
Sure.
I left, actually. Adam stayed in the band a little while longer, but somewhere after that, while they were trying to replace me, Adam ended up auditioning for Link 80, and he
Right.
went to Link 80. But actually, before he started Link 80, after I'd already left Flat Planet, I started this other band called Fashion Police, which was not a ska band. It was like an electronic new wave rock band. And the reason I started this band was because we had one Flat Planet show that happened shortly before I quit, where Alex, our singer, was like unable to make it, and it was at this dive bar in San Francisco. And I thought, you know what? Let's not cancel this show. Let's just make it be just a crazy show. There's going to be 5 people there, maybe. So let's just have it be something that we do for ourselves, and have it be, and just film it for fun. And so we invited my older brother, who was doing this thing for his church where he would dress up like a tiki and sing death metal. So we said, you're in the band this show. And then our friend Mark Franzen, who was our occasional roadie and just like hilarious dude, you're in the band too. And we had him like dress up as a clown, and he sang Send in the Clowns at one point, just like very dramatically. And all of us just went crazy and we just tried to fill the show with as many weird bits as possible. So after I quit Flat Planet, I was like, I started a band like that one show, and that was Fashion Police. And we invited Adam to be in that band, and then there's a couple other people, just random friends who I thought would just be really into just the insanity of it. But another funny side Adam story is that I found out years later that he didn't know we were starting this like kind of crazy band. He thought we were just starting a band. And then when we were at our first couple of rehearsals and we're writing these like dumb songs, he was just like, what's going on? Like, to himself. And he thought that part of him thought it was like all like one big joke on him. Like we were, like it was like don't tell Adam, but we're going to pretend to start a band and we're just going to like freak him out.
We're going to see how long we can go.
Yeah, that's what he thought was happening at first. But eventually, Fashion Police played like a dozen shows, and they were crazy. They were like, it was very confrontational. We would, like, for instance, we played some show at this community center. It was a Valentine's Day show for some reason. And we all dressed up. I dressed up as a hippie girl. That was my outfit because it was Valentine's Day. And we were going to tell the audience that we loved them repeatedly. That was our bit. And then we had these like kids at the show that were very just like had an attitude and were just too cool to whatever. So I started singling them out. I started yelling at them. I started demanding this one kid that he hugged me. And we just like, everything stopped. Like the band just stopped playing. And I just got in his face. And I just kept telling him, hug me, you fucking hug me right now. And he just like stood there and we just stared at each other and like nobody moved. Eventually he caved and he gave me a hug, and then we started playing again.
There you go. Yeah.
But that was like, that was the level of confrontation that Fashion Police was. And so it got worse too. There was one time where like our very last show, I almost got my ass kicked just because I was I don't know. I was going on this thing about how I wanted to fuck Jesus or something.
Oh.
And the bouncer was like a drunken, born-again Christian who was very angry at what I was saying, and he was like gonna kick my ass over it. But after the show, it's like I just turned it off. I wasn't trying to make you angry.
Right.
And he was so close. He was so close to hitting me.
Dang.
He was so big too. Giant cowboy hat.
Oh boy.
So
yeah.
So about 10 years ago, no, actually 2009, Adam, myself, and Bob Vielma, who used to be in the band Shinobu, we started this band called Narboots, right? Yeah. So Narboots sort of stems from Fashion Police. in a way. Originally, Narboots was a punk rock band. Adam and Bob were kind of talking about doing a band. Adam thought I would be a good person because he always liked my drumming, and we hadn't really played together in a long time. And he had a recording studio friend who was doing a class and needed bands to fill in for the class. Basically, like, you come in, you get a free session, but you sort of have to put up with people learning how to record you.
Right.
That's the trade-off. So Narboots was, we formed for that, but we didn't really form. We were just got together. We wrote like 3 songs. We did a recording session, and then that was it. But it was fun. And Adam had a friend who asked if he wanted to have any band of his open up for them. And so we did. That was at the Stork Club. So after those 2 events, we kind of became a band, but we were still like a punk rock band.
Right.
But so by our 3rd show, Bob couldn't make it. And Adam and I were like talking about it. We're like, what do we do? So, those Fashion Police memories came flooding back. And Adam's like, I can't remember whose idea it was, but him and I were talking. He's like, we're going to do like stoner metal for like 15 minutes. And we wore like these dumb wigs. Actually, Adam got a wig that looks exactly like his hair is now.
Right.
Because he had short hair back then.
Mm-hmm.
So you got this like metal guy, like wig, both of us. And we played this like 15-minute set. And then this big surprise was that we were going to like leave our instruments, and then we were going to press play on an iPod, and we were going to play like 15 minutes of electronic songs. Like just get up and start dancing in the audience. But the songs, we didn't have any songs. So Adam took like 4 or 5 Fashion Police songs, which were like more rock new wave songs, but he turned them into like electronic songs. Mm. And because him and I knew those songs really well. And that was the second half of our set. And the show was like so much fun that we were like, this is part of Narboots now.
Right.
And for a number of years, we did like half instruments, half iPod songs. And the foundation of the iPod songs were those Fashion Police songs, which eventually we wrote new ones. But yeah, and it definitely, the energy too came from that Fashion Police thing, where it was like trying to be surprising and crazy, but it wasn't as confrontational. Like there was, when we did Fashion Police, it was very confrontational. And I think some of that was because we were, in our early 20s, and we were like just going through what you go through when you're going from your sort of teenage years to adulthood, and just everything's just crazy. That was all just getting like just put on the stage at the Fashion Police show and just made into like a performance. But Narboots was, we were in our 30s, so it was more like, whoa, we're old people and we have a band now and it's fun, so we're just gonna have fun. Yeah. That was the vibe.
Yeah, Narboots was always fun to watch. I got to play, I think I played 1 show with you guys at the Stork Club with my band Snipers. And but then I saw you a handful of times, and you guys were always fun to watch. That's for sure.
Yeah. We kind of went on hiatus shortly before the lockdown because Adam was getting more interested in Omnigun.
Right.
Which is fine because I was so consumed with trying to write this book. This was like, once I got to like late 2018 and all of 2019, like I was just letting go of writing jobs. I was just, I could not find enough time to work on this book because it was so consuming to get it to where I needed it to be.
Right.
And even playing shows was just really a big pain in the ass. So I was focusing on trying to finish this book. Adam was wanting to do Omnigun. And so Narboots kind of was basically on hiatus. And we were talking about the possibility of bringing it back, earlier this year, but then live music stopped. So there's no way we can't do Narboots until everybody has a vaccine, because our shows are all about invading space, and we can't do like the socially distant show. This wouldn't make sense at all.
Yeah, I think people really need to experience Narboots. Like just listening to you guys doesn't really do the trick.
So we're not going to play a show until we can play like an actual Narboots show.
Right. Yeah.
But I got to be involved with Omnigun. When Adam recorded his album, he basically called up all his drummer friends, which was like me and want to say like,
I think
I
Reese
know,
Noble and yeah.
yeah, well, I went to the studio in San Jose, and it was Justin was there, Amos, Brent Friedman was there, and I think it was just the three of us. He had talked to another person or two about doing it. I'm not sure. Yeah, maybe they did it at a different time, but it was the three of us. I played on two of the songs. It was let's see, yeah, rather be alone and rewrite history were the two I played on, and they're like probably the most Scottish, the most like slower Scottish songs, and which was fun. But so he made a video for Rewrite History, and he had me be in that video, but we didn't want a drum in it. He had trombones. There's horns in that song. So me and his friend Mark pretended to play trombone in that video. Have you seen that video?
I have.
Yeah.
I love that video and I love that song. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like a ska party.
Mm-hmm.
It's like,
yeah.
He walks in. He's like outside. He like
kind of walking along. Yeah.
Yeah. There's like a ska party already happening, and me and Mark are just like, going back and forth with our trombones and pretending to play. So I think it's one of my greatest achievements in the ska scene.
Nice. Well, I mean, it seems like trombones and saxophones go hand in hand with ska anymore, right?
Yeah.
And, one of the things that I, like to dig into in the show is I want to find out if you had to pick 5 records that you would want to be stuck on an island with, what would those be?
Okay. I'm gonna go just with the ska edition of this, even though not necessarily would I only take ska with me if I was to go on a desert island. But we'll just do that just to stay within the theme.
Yeah, I dig it.
All right, so we're gonna have to go with the Specials debut album, of course. Then we're also gonna go with the Selector, but we're gonna go with their second album, Celebrate the Bullet, which is their underrated classic. We're going to have to do Fishbone. I'm going to pick Ma and Pa. I'm sorry, not Ma and Pa. It's Truth and Soul.
Okay.
Ma and Pa's a song on that album. Right. Operation Ivy, Energy, or the whole discography, CD will work. And lastly, we'll go with Hepcat, Right on Time.
That's a great list, man.
Yeah.
Those are all great albums. And like, dude, Hepcat and Fishbone, God, man, more people need to be listening to them all the time. All the time. But great list, man. Well, Aaron, it's been so great to talk to you, and I really enjoyed the book. Thank you again for letting me get a copy of it before it got released.
Yeah.
And thanks again for sending me the hard copy as well. Anyone who is interested in learning more about the history of ska and like why it should get more acclaim than it currently does, definitely check it out. Check out Narboots, check out Flat Planet. Is Flat Planet stuff available online?
Not really. There's some stuff you can find if you dig around on YouTube, but I have stuff that's not been released that I don't know. We're talking about the potential of putting it out there. So it's just talk at this point, though.
But we'll definitely put links to where people can find the book, and as well as any other links that you want. And then we're going to end the podcast with that video from Omnigon.
Oh, awesome.
So everyone gets to see you wailing on the trombone. But Aaron, pleasure to have you here. And, I hope you're staying safe and hope you have a good holiday. We'll talk to you real soon.
Great. Thank you. Have a good one too.